Welcome, I hope your coffee is warm. Today, let's look at the most impactful new Commander concepts from Modern Horizons 3. I know it's a modern set, but there are still a lot of new goodies for Commander. Like Satya, Aetherflux Genius. This is the man that created Aetherborn on Kaladesh, and that's exactly why he can copy one of your creatures when he attacks. This discharges to Aether energy and you get to keep the creature if you pay energy equal to its toughness. Now, energy isn't a new thing and copying creatures isn't either, but I feel like this guy gives new life to the energy mechanic in Commander. A new support card has been added too, Aether Revolt. This card enables all of your sources to deal 2 extra damage when you enable Revolt. And it lets you deal damage equal to the amount of energy you gain. This deck needed a commander and a finisher, and it got both. Now, in this deck, a great thing to add are cards like Whirler Virtuoso, which adds 3 energy when it enters the battlefield. So when you create a copy of it, you get another 3 energy. And very easily you get to copy the guy if you want to, because it's 3 mana as well. Cards like Aetherstorm Rock, a 4 mana card that says whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you get an energy. Doesn't need to get copied itself, but you could. And then the other Aetherstorm Rock will give you another energy as well. So this adds on very quickly. And then I suggest finishing off with other types of value engines and finishers in energy decks like Aetherworks Marvel, which lets you put a card from the top of your library, the top 6 even, onto the battlefield or casting them without paying their mana costs. Next up is a new card that plays around experience counters, and this one is interesting because yes, we have had experience counters before, of course, but we haven't had a 5-color commander for them. This one has 5 colors in its activated ability. Aslask, the Swelling Scourge, a mixture of Eldrazi Titans, is a 3 mana 2/2 that says whenever it or another colorless creature you control dies, you get an experience counter. So you will want some colorless cards in here. And then for 5 mana, creatures you control get +X, where X is the number of experience counters you have. And Science and Spawns you control gain Indestructible and Annihilator 1 until end of turn, and you can get a lot of those if you want. Now, good cards in here are cards like Azuri that are really good with experience counters, because at the beginning of combat on your turn you put X+1 counters on another target creature you control, and this is pretty easy to combo off with when you are playing with, for example, the Spawns that have less than 2 power. Giving you more experience counters. Marin of Clan Nel Toth is another card that gives you more experience counters whenever any other creature dies. And you get to return more creatures from your graveyard when you get more experience counters. And Othari is really simple because when you attack with the Phoenix, you get to gain another experience counter, create a bunch of 2/2 rebels that might then die as well, and you can easily get it back with those rebels. Next up is a new old card that is Chthonian Nightmare. A version of this has been banned before, but this one has a new restriction and thus can be played in Commander again. Chthonian Nightmare is a 2 mana enchantment that enters the battlefield, gives you 3 energy, so another energy thing but really different. Then you get to pay an amount of energy, sacrifice the creature, return it to its owner's hand, and then return target creature card with mana value X equal to the energy cost that you paid from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you activate this only as a sorcery. The interesting thing is that then, of course, you can play Chthonian Nightmare again and you get another 3 energy. Meaning, if you return a creature with less than 3 mana, then you get a surplus of energy and you get to sort of storm off with this in a way. Now, a really great deck for this is of course something where you love to sacrifice creatures, Korvold being the main commander for this. A really good card with this is Mahadi Emporium Master, a 3-mana cat devil that says at the beginning of your end step, you create a treasure token for each creature that died this turn, meaning that you get a bunch of mana to play more Chthonian Nightmares with. You do get those only at the end of your turn, but that is a great way to to make more value, and treasures are really easy to sacrifice, meaning that you get to easily storm off with Korvold as well, drawing a bunch of cards and of course winning in the Korvold way, slowly. And a great card with Chthonian Nightmares is Sakura Tribe Elder, which is really easy to sacrifice because it sacrifices itself, searches a basic land card, and it is cheaper than 3 mana, so you can play this over and over again, even netting you an extra energy counter. Next up is Silverquill Lecturer, another non-commander. As you might notice, these cards aren't necessarily commanders because this is about concepts that improve decks. Silverquill Lecturer is a 5-mana card, so pretty expensive, but then all your creature spells have Demonstrate, meaning that you get to copy them. But if you do, you choose an opponent to also copy it. Each copy becomes a token, which is necessary and important for the cards that fit well with it. I would say put this in your Kadric Soul Kindler deck that not many people have, I think. It's a 4-mana dwarf that says the legend rule doesn't apply to tokens you control, and with doubling every of your creatures, including your legends, this is very important because they both get to stick around, and then whenever another non-token legendary permanent enters battlefield under your control, you may pay 1 to copy it, but you have to sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Of course, with the Lecturer you don't get that drawback, you get to keep those legendary creatures as long as Kadric is around as well. Cards that work well with this are Jeru and Hazoret, for example, that work really well with legendary creatures, but you also would love to double Jeru and Hazoret and your opponents can't do as much with it, which is very important for a Demonstrate deck. Jeru and Hazoret says whenever it attacks, look at the top 6 card of your library, again 6. You may exile a legendary card from among them and put the rest on the bottom of the library in any order, in a random order. This means that you get to exile a legendary creature, play it. Your opponents are probably not finding a legendary creature every time, but you are in a legendary deck. And then onto end of turn you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost, so it is free. Who doesn't like that? And the Lina Wild Mage works really well because it copies itself. It already worked well with Kadric, but this just strengthens it so much that I think maybe Kadric might be a little bit more popular for the coming time. The Lina of course says when she attacks, choose target creature you control, then roll a d20. You have about 1/3, I think it's if you roll 1 through 14, you create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of the creature. Except it's not legendary and it has exiled this creature at the end of combat. And if you roll a 15 until a 20, then you get to create one of those tokens and roll again. So you get to storm off with this. But of course you have 2 Delinas, and of course whenever another non-token legendary permanent enters, which I'm guessing you try to do with this, creating more. No, you can't really make more tokens, non-tokens actually with this, but the Lina is really good when copied. Next up is Arna Kennerroot, Sky Captain. It's a 5-mana human knight with a bird, which is not mentioned on the card at all, except for the flying part. But I mean, in the creature type is what I meant. But flying and lifelink because it's a good guy. Ward to discard a card, so well, your opponents do need to discard a card in order to target this card. And whenever a modified creature you control attacks, meaning having a counter on it, or an equipment or an enchantment, double the number of each kind of counter on it. So +1 counters get doubled. Then for each non-token permanent attached to it, create a token that's a copy of the permanent attached to that creature. I think this is the most interesting part, because doubling enchantments and making them into tokens can be very powerful. The same for equipments, which will even stick around when your creature dies. One thing that works really well is All That Glitters. It's a 2-mana enchantment that gives +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. Very importantly, it works with artifacts and enchantments, and of course doubling this makes it go from +1/+1 to +4/+4 already. And if you do that often enough, this will go out exponentially, making you a lot of power and toughness. Pure Steel Paladin is a 2-mana card that says whenever an equipment enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. And of course, you will be doubling a lot of equipments here. And equipments you control have equip 0 as long as you control 3 or more artifacts, which you will easily do once you start doubling your equipments. And Mondrak is interesting because it says if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, you create twice as much, meaning you get to double those enchantments and equipments that you are copying, making you storm off even faster. Next up is an archetype that also isn't new, but is, I think, really different with these cards. Ulalak Fused Atrocity, another fused Eldrazi. It has the Void, so it is really colorless, but it has 5 colors again. And it says whenever you cast an Eldrazi spell, so you will have to be Eldrazi tribal. But this is a bit different from just running 2 or 3 Eldrazi that are really expensive, ramping up to them with probably green, and then winning with 1 Eldrazi. This is when you play an Eldrazi, pay 2 colorless mana if you do copy all spells you control. Then copy all other activated and triggered abilities you control, and you may choose new targets for the copies. So copying all the abilities, copying all the spells. And I think this has a potential to feel really, again, exponential, let's say. Echoes of Eternity sort of plays into this. It's a 6-mana Kindred enchantment. It's an Eldrazi itself as well, so its abilities can be copied. If a triggered ability of a colorless spell you control or another colorless permanent you control triggers, it triggers an additional time. So basically you have 2 commanders, you might say. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, you also copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. And why do I think this will change the Eldrazi archetype? Well, of course, you can still play the big Eldrazi's that are really fun, and you can get to copy them if you want. But copying the big ones isn't really what's really cool about this, because 1 would have probably also been enough to, well, at least put a dent into the games of your opponents. The interesting thing to me is that you get to copy the small ones and copy all the abilities and everything that's on the stack, basically. Idol of False Gods is, for example, a 2-mana artifact, an Eldrazi, that you pay 2 to tap and create a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature. These will be really strong in your deck, as you will be buffing them as well. Otherwise, it's just a way to save up your mana. Then whenever another Eldrazi you control dies, you put a +1 counter on the idol, and if you have 8 or more, it awakens into a creature with those +1 counters and annihilate it too. But copying those will be strong as well, even if it's just an uncommon. Oblivion Sower, another example that works really well here, is a 6-mana 5/8, but when you cast this spell, target opponent exiles the top 4 cards of their library, and you may put the lands that player owns from exile onto the battlefield under your control. Doubling this ability is really strong as well, as you will be able to exile even more and get all of those lands onto the battlefield, probably getting you up to the point where you can play Kozilek next turn. Shiogengar is the Sire of Famine, which is really interesting to me because it's an angel tribal, an angel typal commander that says sacrifice another creature, you create a blood token. And if you sacrifice an angel this way, so you want to sacrifice angels this way, you create a number of blood tokens equal to its toughness. And what can you do with those blood tokens except for digging through your deck? You can pay 3 mana, sacrifice 6 of them, and return each creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Mass recursion, and also a demon that works well with angels, which are 2 things that are really interesting to me. Also works with vampires in a way, because all of the creatures you return are vampires too. So what do you need? Well, you need angels, of course. You need ways to mill, because you want a lot of cards in your graveyard that are very expensive. Another way to do this is draw a lot of cards with your blood tokens and discarding the big ones that you want to recur. Angel of Suffering is an interesting one, for example, because it says if damage would be dealt to you, prevent it and mill twice as many cards. If you can play this and have damage be dealt to you, don't know why that would happen, but you mill a lot of cards, so that's one thing you can do. Solemnity is a 3 mana enchantment that's really great in this deck because it prevents players from getting counters, and that's the most important part here. Gengar makes you put finality counters on creatures, which makes them get exiled when they die. But if they can't get such a counter, then you can return them from the graveyard over and over again, making you very easily storm off, as its ability is only 3 mana. And cards that work well with blood tokens are great here too. This one also works with vampires weirdly, but I thought the most interesting part about this is that for 2 mana you can sacrifice it and 13 blood tokens, which you will probably easily get, and you force each opponent to lose 13 life and you gain 13 life as well. Next up is Kudo, the King Among Bears. Aside from being a really cool guy, this 2 mana 2/2 bear, which is exactly what a bear should be, makes other creatures have base power and toughness 2/2 as well, and it makes them bears. And I think this is a really interesting card for one, and the flavor is really cute as well. Born from the greatest granite boulder, nursed on the sweetest honey, crowned amid a raging blizzard. I want to know more about this antler bear. One thing that is very interesting is that all of your creatures will have exactly the same amount of power and toughness. This means that you can, for example, give all of them trample. Of course, you will need to buff them a bit for that to matter, really. Symmetry Matrix is interesting because for 4 mana you have an artifact where every time you play such a creature that has equal power and toughness, and it ends the battlefield under your control this way, you may pay 1 to draw a card. So that's a really cheap way, money-wise, to get you a lot of cards. And one thing that works really well with this is Elesh Norn, because if your opponents can't buff their creatures, they get -2/-2, which is exactly enough to destroy them. So that's basically a board wipe here. Elesh Norn, funnily enough, will also be a 2/2 and will be the weakest one on your side. Harbinger of the Seas isn't a new thing, because in red this has existed, but giving blue this ability is really interesting to me. For 3 mana, non-basic lands are islands. This means that all of your opponents and all of your multicolored lands that are non-basic will only be islands. And your opponents will lose a lot of colors, especially with the current meta where there are a lot of 3 mana or 3 color decks around. I think this is really important to shut down those decks and make them think about their mana bases a little bit more. Things that work well with this, which are less important than the fact that it is just really good and could be played in almost any deck, are Merfolk, of course, and especially ones with Island Walk, because all of your opponents will have islands. So that works really well. Doesn't really matter which cards you use, but I would say the perfect deck for this card, synergy-wise, is a Merfolk deck, because you can very easily give all of your Merfolk Island Walk and they will all be sort of unblockable. Warren Soul Trader is the last one that's just really strong as well, but has a lot of combos that are very easy to make, I would say. But even accidentally while playing this card, you might be storming off really fast. It's a 3 mana zombie goblin wizard, so this one does get 3 types. You pay 1 life, so that's the drawback. You sacrifice another creature and you create a treasure token. Of course, you will probably want to sacrifice those creatures, but creating a treasure token while doing this makes sure that you have enough mana to keep storming off while you are doing all of your crazy sacrifice creature stuff. One commander that works really well with this is Shadowfang, Scroll General. It's a 3 mana scroll that says, if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus that many 1/1 scroll tokens are created instead. Meaning that if you sacrifice, for example, a green scroll token, you get to create a treasure. And because you create a treasure, you get to create a new scroll. That means that you get to do that all over again, and until you run out of life, this goes sort of infinite already. If you pair that with a card like Prosperous Innkeeper, which gives you 1 life whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, this is actually infinite. Pair that, for example, or not even that, but put a Pitiless Plunderer on the battlefield, and whenever another creature you control dies, you create another treasure token, meaning you get 2, and meaning you get to very easily storm off. For example, when you sacrifice your first scroll, you already get to play the Prosperous Innkeeper to keep going infinite. I think this is really strong and can be done so quickly, probably turn 4 easily even, and that means that this will, I think, warp the format at least a little bit. So watch out for those cards. Thank you for watching. Let me know what your favorite new card is and in which decks you will put it. Have a nice day.